The Galactic Assembly had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. 700 different species worked together, traded together, and kept peace together across three great arms of the Milky Way galaxy. They had built stations the size of moons. They had created ships that could cross the galaxy in days. They believed they knew everything worth knowing about the universe. They were wrong. Deep in the archives of the Assembly, buried under millions of files and forgotten by almost everyone, there was a single short report about a small blue planet on the edge of the Orion Arm. The planet was called Earth by its people, and those people called themselves humans. A survey probe had passed through their solar system 3,000 years ago and found them to be primitive creatures, barely able to send radio signals into space. The probe had recorded some basic information, marked the species as unimportant, and moved on. No one had thought about humans since then. Why would they? The galaxy was full of advanced civilizations with real power and real influence. One primitive species on one small planet meant nothing to anyone. Commander Al of the Diplomatic Corps had served the Assembly for 90 years. She was tall and thin, with shimmering blue scales that changed color with her moods and large compound eyes that could see light no other species could perceive. She had negotiated treaties between warring empires. She had solved disputes that had lasted for centuries. She thought she had seen everything the galaxy had to offer. Then the swarm came. No one knew where they came from. They appeared at the edge of known space like a plague of locusts, millions of ships that were part machine and part living creature. They did not negotiate. They did not trade. They did not even communicate in any way the Assembly could understand. They simply consumed. Every world they touched was stripped bare of resources. Every species they encountered was either killed or scattered like dust in the wind. The Assembly sent its greatest fleet to stop them at the nebula. 4,000 warships from dozens of species, carrying the most advanced weapons in the galaxy. It was the largest military force the Assembly had ever gathered in one place. The battle lasted less than 4 hours. When it was over, 60% of the Assembly fleet was destroyed. The rest fled in chaos, their commanders screaming for help that would not come. Al watched the reports come in from her office on the diplomatic station. World after world fell to the swarm. Billions of refugees fled toward the inner systems, overwhelming every station and colony in their path. The Assembly Council met in emergency session after emergency session, but they could not agree on anything. Some wanted to negotiate. Some wanted to abandon the outer territories and build new defenses. Some wanted to surrender and hope for mercy. No one believed they could actually win. It was during one of these endless meetings that the signal came. At first, the communication officers thought it was a mistake. The signal was crude, broadcast on electromagnetic frequencies that most species had stopped using thousands of years ago. It came from the Orion Arm, from a region of space that the Assembly had ignored for so long that their maps barely showed it. But when they decoded the message, everything changed. "This is Admiral Benjamin Cole of the United Earth Defense Force. We have been monitoring your transmissions. We are coming." Al remembered the confusion that swept through the council chamber. Humans, the primitive species from that ancient survey report, they still existed. They had developed space travel, and they were offering to help in a war against an enemy that had crushed the most powerful fleet in galactic history. High Counselor N, the elderly who led the Assembly, dismissed the message with a wave of her thin gray hand. "Irrelevant," she said. "Even if these humans have achieved basic space flight, what could they possibly do against we lost 4,000 ships at? This primitive species probably has a few dozen at most. They would be throwing their lives away for nothing." Most of the council agreed. The message was filed away as a curiosity, something to be studied later if there was a later. The endless debates about strategy and survival continued. But Al could not forget the message. There was something in the voice of Admiral Cole that stayed with her. It was not the voice of someone who was delusional or foolish. It was calm, confident, and absolutely certain. Whoever this human was, he believed completely in what he was saying. She began to dig into the archives, searching for everything the Assembly had ever recorded about Earth and its people. What she found was not much, but it was enough to make her scales turn a worried shade of purple. The survey probe had recorded radio transmissions from Earth. Most of them were entertainment or news broadcasts that made little sense without context, but some of them were about war. Humans, it seemed, had spent most of their history fighting each other. They had developed weapons that could destroy entire cities. They had fought conflicts that killed millions of their own kind. They had come close to wiping themselves out more than once. And they had survived. Al thought about her own people, they had not fought a major war in over 2,000 years. The Assembly had kept the peace, and peace had made them soft. When they came, the military had crumbled like paper. They had forgotten how to fight. They had forgotten how to sacrifice. They had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy that could not be reasoned with. Had the humans forgotten these things? Or had their violent history taught them lessons that the Assembly had never learned? 3 weeks after the first message, a new signal reached the Assembly. This one was different. It was not a promise. It was an announcement. Assembly forces, this is Admiral Cole. We have arrived at the system. We count approximately 1,000 vessels engaging your defensive fleet. We count 40 of your ships still fighting. Tell them to hold on. Help is here. Al rushed to the command center, where dozens of officers were staring at their screens in disbelief. The long-range sensors showed something impossible. A fleet of human ships, over 200 of them, had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. They were not running. They were not hiding. They were forming into attack formation and moving straight toward the swarm. "They're insane," someone whispered. "They outnumber them 4-1. They'll be slaughtered." But Al was not so sure. She watched the human ships advance, their formation tight and disciplined, their weapons already charging. She thought about the voice of Admiral Cole, so calm and so certain. She thought about the ancient reports of human history, of a species that had survived wars that would have destroyed any other civilization. And for the first time since they had appeared, Al felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt hope. Lieutenant Commander Wright had been in the Navy for 15 years. She had fought pirates in the asteroid belts of Sol system. She had survived the brutal campaigns against the Collective during the Contact War. She had watched friends die in the cold darkness of space and had kept fighting anyway. She thought nothing could surprise her anymore. But standing on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching the system burn on the tactical display, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. It was not fear. Had made peace with fear years ago. It was anger. Pure, simple anger at what she was seeing. 3 worlds in the system had already fallen to the 12 billion people, members of species called the, were either dead or running for their lives. The enemy fleet, over 1,000 ships of twisted metal and organic matter, was tearing apart the last defenders of the 4th planet. 40 ships were all that remained of the system's defense force, and they were dying one by one as watched. Admiral Benjamin Cole's voice came through the command channel. He was 63 years old, with gray hair and a face that showed every year of service. But his voice was steady, the same voice that had led humanity through the darkest days of the Contact War. "All ships, this is the Admiral. We didn't travel 1,800 light years to watch. Tactical formation Delta. Engage the enemy." Felt the Defiance's engines roar to life beneath her feet. Around her, 247 human warships began their advance toward the swarm. She looked at her bridge crew, at the men and women who had volunteered for this mission knowing they might never come home. Their faces were calm. Their hands were steady on their controls. This was what they had trained for. This was what they had been born for. They noticed them coming, of course. A portion of their fleet, perhaps 300 ships, broke away from the attack on the defenders and turned to face the human fleet, studied them on her tactical display. Each ship was a nightmare of twisted metal and poolsing organic tissue, covered with weapons that had torn through assembly warships like they were made of paper. The odds were bad, very bad, but had faced bad odds before. The enemy opened fire first. Thousands of projectiles, a mix of plasma and something that looked almost biological, streaked across the void toward the human fleet. Watched them come, counting the seconds until impact. Point defense systems active, her weapons officer reported. Engaging. Across the human fleet, automated defense systems came to life. Thousands of small weapons tracked the incoming fire and began shooting it down. The space between the two fleets became a wall of explosions as human guns destroyed projectile after projectile. The assembly species had nothing like this. Their ships relied on shields and armor to absorb enemy fire, but humans had learned a different lesson from their wars. The best defense was not to get hit at all. When the barrage ended, the human fleet was still intact. Not a single ship had been destroyed. "Return fire," Admiral Cole ordered. "All batteries, show them what we brought." The UES Defiance shuddered as her main guns discharged. Watched the tactical display as 247 human warships opened fire together, pouring destruction into the advancing formation. Human weapons were different from assembly weapons. They were not elegant. They were not sophisticated. They were brutal, designed to punch through armor and tear ships apart from the inside. And they worked. The first ship exploded under the combined fire of a dozen human vessels. Then another. Then another. The enemy formation began to break apart as ship after ship was destroyed or crippled. Heard voices on the assembly communication channels, which human intelligence had quietly accessed weeks before the battle. The surviving and defenders were watching the human assault, and they could not believe what they were seeing. "They're destroying them," a captain said, his voice shaking. "How are they destroying them? Our weapons barely scratched their hulls." "What kind of species is this?" another voice asked. "Where did they come from?" Could have answered that question. Humans came from a small blue world on the edge of the galaxy. They came from a history of endless war, of struggle, of survival against odds that should have killed them 1,000 times over. They came from the ashes of their own mistakes, rebuilt into something stronger. They came to fight. The battle lasted for 3 hours. 3 hours of fire and death, of ships exploding and crews dying in the cold vacuum of space. The human fleet took losses. Watched 18 of their ships disappear from the tactical display, each one representing hundreds of lives lost. The Defiance herself was hit twice, her armor and one of her secondary batteries knocked offline. But for every human ship destroyed, 6 or 7 vessels died. The enemy fleet, which had seemed so invincible just hours before, was being torn apart. Admiral Cole kept pushing. That was the human way. When you had the enemy on the defensive, you did not let up. You did not give them time to recover. You kept hitting them until they broke. They broke. Their formation collapsed completely as the survivors began to flee. Not in an organized retreat, but in pure panic. Ships scattered in every direction, trying to escape the human guns that had destroyed so many of their kind. Cole's voice came over the channel again. "Assembly forces, this is Admiral Cole. We're pushing them back, but we need you with us. Form up on our flanks. Let's finish this together." Watched as the 40 surviving assembly ships, which had been moments from destruction when the humans arrived, began to move. They were damaged, tired, and probably terrified, but they were still alive because of humanity, and now they were joining the fight. The UES Defiance found herself positioned alongside a cruiser called the Vigilant Promise. Its hull was blackened with burns and its movements were sluggish, but it was still fighting. Opened a communication channel to the alien ship. "Vessel, this is the Defiance. We've got enemy ships trying to circle around your port side. We'll cover you if you can keep firing at their main formation." There was a moment of silence. Then a female voice answered, speaking through a translator that made her words slightly mechanical. "Understood, Defiance. We will hold, and thank you for coming." Smiled, though she knew the alien could not see it. "That's what we do. Defiance out." The battle continued for another 2 hours. By the end, the fleet had been reduced to scattered fragments fleeing into the darkness. System was still burning, 3 of its worlds lost forever, but the 4th planet was safe. The refugees had escaped, and for the first time since the war began, the enemy had been defeated. Leaned back in her command chair, suddenly feeling every hour of the battle in her bones. Around her, her crew was cheering, embracing each other, celebrating the victory they had won against impossible odds. But was thinking about the ships they had lost, the friends who would not be going home, the price they had paid for this moment. It was worth it, she knew that. Every sacrifice was worth it if it meant saving lives. But it still hurt, it would always hurt. That was the human burden. They carried the weight of their dead with them always, and they kept fighting anyway. Commander Al had served in the fleet for 90 years. She had studied military tactics at the finest academies in the assembly. She had read every strategic text written by every species in the coalition. She thought she understood war. She was wrong. From the bridge of her damaged cruiser, the Vigilant Promise, she watched the human fleet fight and felt her entire understanding of combat crumble like dust. These humans did not fight like any species she had ever seen. They did not fight like with careful plans and elegant maneuvers. They did not fight like with overwhelming numbers and defensive formations. They did not fight like any of the 700 species in the assembly. They fought like predators, like hunters who had finally found prey worthy of their attention. The assembly's military doctrine was based on caution. When a formation was threatened, the proper response was to retreat, regroup, and attack again from a position of strength. This approach had kept the peace for thousands of years. It had prevented unnecessary casualties. It had been the foundation of galactic civilization. The humans ignored it completely. When their formations were threatened, they did not retreat. They pushed harder. When they tried to surround them, they charged straight through the encirclement instead of pulling back. When they took damage, they kept firing. When they lost ships, the survivors closed ranks and hit even harder. It was madness. It was chaos. It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing Al had ever witnessed. She studied the human ships through her sensors, trying to understand what made them so effective. Assembly warships were designed for multiple purposes. They had diplomatic quarters for negotiations, scientific laboratories for research, comfortable living spaces for crews who might spend years in space. They were tools of civilization, weapons only when necessary. Human ships were different. Every part of them was dedicated to one purpose: destruction. Their hulls were thick with armor that assembly engineers would consider wasteful. Their weapons were oversized, crude by galactic standards but devastatingly powerful. Their engines were huge, giving them speed and maneuverability that should have been impossible for vessels their size. There were no luxuries on these ships, no comfort, no beauty, just weapons, armor, and the bare minimum needed to keep the crew alive long enough to use them. What kind of species would build ships like this? What kind of history would create a civilization that saw war as the primary purpose of space travel? Al thought about the ancient survey report, about the primitive humans who had been fighting each other when the probe passed through their system. 3,000 years ago, they had been barely capable of reaching their own moon. Now they had crossed the galaxy to fight an enemy that had nothing to do with them. What had happened in those 3,000 years? What had they survived? What had they become? A communication signal interrupted her thoughts. It was from the human destroyer that had positioned itself alongside the Vigilant Promise during the battle. The ship was called the UES Relentless, and it looked like it had been through hell. Its hull was scorched black in a dozen places. One of its main gun turrets had been completely destroyed. Atmosphere was venting from at least 3 breaches that the crew was still trying to seal. But it was still fighting. Its remaining weapons were still firing. Its engines were still burning. The voice that came through the translator was young, female, and completely calm despite the chaos around her. "Vessel, this is Lieutenant Price of the Relentless. We've got 4 ships trying to flank your position. We'll take the 2 on the left if you can handle the others." Al was surprised by how natural it felt to coordinate with the human officer. Understood, relentless, engaging now. The vigilant promise turned her remaining weapons toward the approaching enemy. Al watched her crew work, moving with a determination she had not seen from them before. They had been terrified when the battle started. They had been preparing to die. But watching the humans fight, watching them refuse to give up even when the odds were impossible, had changed something in them. If these strange beings from a forgotten corner of the galaxy could keep fighting, then so could they. The 4 ships died in less than 10 minutes. The combined fire of the Relentless and the Vigilant Promise tore them apart one by one. When the last enemy vessel exploded, Al heard cheering from her bridge crew. It was the first time they had celebrated anything since the war began. "Good shooting," Lieutenant Price said over the communication channel. "Keep it up. We're going to win this." Al wanted to ask how the young human could be so certain. The battle was not over. They had lost ships. They were outnumbered. Victory was far from guaranteed. But she did not ask, because she was beginning to understand something about these humans. They did not fight because they thought they would win. They did not calculate odds and make careful decisions based on probability. They fought because fighting was what they did. They fought because giving up was not something they knew how to do. It was irrational. It was inefficient. It was completely against everything the Assembly had taught her about military strategy. And it was working. The tide of battle turned over the next 3 hours. The human fleet kept pushing, kept attacking, kept destroying. Admiral Cole seemed to know exactly when to press forward and when to consolidate. His tactics were aggressive but not reckless, bold but not stupid. He found weaknesses in the formation that Al had not even recognized as weaknesses and tore them apart. The assembly ships that had survived the initial assault began to rally. They formed up alongside the human fleet, adding their firepower to the assault. Al found herself commanding a mixed force of human ships, coordinating attacks that would have seemed impossible just hours before. She learned things about humans during those hours. She learned that they cursed constantly while fighting, using words that her translator could not properly render. She learned that they made jokes in the middle of combat, dark humor that helped them cope with the fear and death around them. She learned that they called each other by strange nicknames and insulted each other with obvious affection. They were nothing like the dignified, reserved species of the assembly. They were loud, emotional, unpredictable, and absolutely fearless. By the time the finally broke, fleeing into the darkness in complete disarray, Al had come to a decision. They had survived this day because of the humans. The assembly had been given a second chance because a species they had forgotten about for 3,000 years had chosen to help them. Whatever happened next, Al was going to make sure that humanity was never forgotten again. She opened a channel to Admiral Cole's flagship. "Admiral, this is Commander Al of the Diplomatic Corps. On behalf of my people and the Assembly, I want to thank you for what you have done today." There was a brief pause before Cole's steady voice responded. "No thanks necessary, Commander. We came because it was the right thing to do. Now let's make sure the enemy doesn't get a chance to regroup. There's still work to be done." Al nodded, even though the human could not see her. "Agreed, Admiral. The Vigilant Promise is at your command." It felt strange to say those words. An officer, serving under a human commander. A member of a species that had thought itself superior, following the orders of beings they had dismissed as primitives. But it also felt right. The galaxy had changed today. Everything had changed. And Al was glad to be part of it. The battle lasted for 11 hours. When the last ship fled into the darkness between stars, the human fleet and their new assembly allies had won the greatest victory in galactic history. For the first time since the war began, the enemy had been broken. But victory never comes without a price. Nurse practitioner Lisa moved through the medical bay of the UES Defiance, stepping over debris and working around damaged equipment. The ship had been hit multiple times during the battle. One entire section had been exposed to vacuum, killing everyone inside instantly. Another section had caught fire, and the crew had barely managed to contain it before it spread to the ammunition storage. The medical bay was overflowing with wounded. They lay on tables, on benches, on the floor. Some were unconscious, kept alive by machines that pumped air into their lungs and blood through their veins. Others were awake, their faces twisted with pain as they waited for treatment. Lisa had been trained for this. She had practiced mass casualty procedures dozens of times in simulations, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. The smell of blood and burned flesh, the sounds of people crying out for help, the knowledge that no matter how fast she worked, some of them were going to die. She moved from patient to patient doing what she could, setting broken bones, sealing wounds, injecting painkillers to ease suffering she could not cure. Behind her, other medics and doctors worked with the same desperate efficiency, trying to save as many lives as possible. A young ensign named was brought in on a stretcher. Both of his legs were shattered, crushed when his section of the ship had been breached during the battle. He was pale from blood loss, barely conscious, but when Lisa leaned over him, his eyes focused on her face. "Did we win?" he asked, his voice rough and weak. Lisa checked his vital signs as she answered. "We won. They are retreating. We saved the system." His face split into a grin despite his injuries. It was a strange thing to see, a smile on the face of someone so badly hurt, but Lisa understood. They had come here knowing they might die. They had fought anyway because it was the right thing to do, and they had won. "Good," said. "That's good. Tell them. Tell them we're not done yet." Lisa did not have to ask who he meant. The assembly, the galaxy, everyone who was watching, wanted them to know that this was just the beginning. She squeezed his hand gently. "I'll tell them. Now hold still. We're going to take care of you." The hours after the battle were a blur of work and exhaustion. Lisa treated wound after wound until her hands were stained with blood and her back ached from bending over patients. She lost 4 people despite her best efforts. Each death hit her like a physical blow, but she kept working. There was no time to grieve. Not yet. In the officers' quarters of the flagship UES Constellation, Admiral Benjamin Cole was meeting with delegations from a dozen assembly species. They had come to thank him, to ask questions, to try to understand what had happened in their system. Commander Al was among them. She entered the conference room and found the Admiral standing by a viewport looking out at the stars. He looked tired. The weight of command, the weight of all the lives lost, showed in the lines of his face. "Commander Al," he said, turning to greet her, "your ships fought well today." "Your ship saved us," she replied. "All of us. The Assembly owes humanity a debt that cannot easily be repaid." Cole shook his head. "We didn't come here for debts. We came because it was the right thing to do." Al studied him, trying to understand. In her experience, no species did anything without expecting something in return. That was how the galaxy worked. Every favor came with a price. Every alliance was based on mutual benefit. "You lost thousands of your people," she said. "Your fleet is damaged. You had no obligation to help us. We ignored your species for 3,000 years. Why did you come?" The Admiral was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars. 3,000 years ago," he said, "when your survey probe passed through our system, humanity was barely able to look up at the sky. We were alone, struggling to survive on a single world with no idea that the universe was full of life. If that probe had stopped, if your people had made contact with us then, maybe things would have been different. He turned back to Al. But you didn't stop. You looked at us and saw nothing worth your time, and maybe you were right. Maybe we weren't ready, but we kept going anyway. We fought our way into space. We survived wars that nearly destroyed us. We built fleets. We became stronger. Al listened, her scales shifting to a thoughtful shade of blue. When we intercepted your distress signals, Cole continued, we could have ignored them, the same way you ignored us. We could have stayed safe in our own corner of the galaxy and let the destroy everything else. But that's not who we are. He met her eyes directly. Humanity doesn't abandon people who need help, even if they're strangers, even if they never did anything for us. Because one day we might be the ones who need help, and we'd like to think that someone would come. Al felt something shift inside her. For 3,000 years, her people had operated on principles of careful calculation. They never spent resources without guaranteed return. They never took risks unless the benefit was clear. It had made them powerful, but it had also made them weak. When the came, no one had been willing to sacrifice for anyone else. Except the humans. "You are a strange species, Admiral Cole," she said finally. He smiled, and for a moment the tiredness in his face faded. "We get that a lot." The conversation continued for another hour. Al asked questions about human history, about their wars, about how they had developed so quickly after being dismissed as primitives. Cole answered honestly, holding nothing back. He told her about the centuries of conflict that had nearly destroyed Earth. He told her about the contact war against the first alien species humanity had encountered. He told her about the hard lessons they had learned from their own violent past. "We know what it's like to be on the edge of extinction," he said. "We know what it's like to fight enemies who want to wipe you out completely. When we saw what they were doing to your people, we couldn't just stand by and watch. We've been where you are. We know how it feels." Al nodded slowly. "And now, what do you want from the assembly?" "Friendship," Cole said simply. "Partnership. A chance to be part of something bigger than ourselves. Humanity spent 3,000 years alone. We don't want to be alone anymore." It was such a simple answer, such a human answer. No demands for territory or resources or political power, just a desire to belong. Al made a decision then. She would spend the rest of her life making sure humanity got what they asked for, not because she owed them a debt, although she did, but because they deserved it. Because they had proven that even the smallest species, forgotten by everyone, could change the fate of the entire galaxy. 6 months had passed since the battle of 6 months of reconstruction, negotiation, and change. The swarm had been pushed back to the edge of known space, their fleets broken by combined human and assembly forces in a dozen engagements. They were not defeated completely, but they were no longer an immediate threat. For the first time in years, the galaxy could breathe. Captain Daniel stood at the back of the Galactic Assembly Chamber, watching as representatives from 700 species took their places in the massive hall. The chamber was enormous, with tiered seating that rose toward a dome of crystal and light that showed the stars beyond. Every species in the assembly had sent their most important diplomats to this session. Everyone knew that history was about to be made. Daniel was part of the first official human delegation to the assembly. He still could not quite believe he was here. A year ago, he had been a simple naval captain, commanding a destroyer on patrol in human space. Now he was standing in the heart of galactic civilization, wearing a dress uniform that felt too tight and trying not to look as nervous as he felt. Dr. Maria Santos, the delegation's chief diplomatic advisor, stood beside him. She was calm and composed, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes scanning the chamber with professional interest. She had spent the past 6 months preparing for this moment, studying assembly protocols, learning the customs of dozens of species, making sure humanity would not embarrass itself on the galactic stage. "Remember," she said quietly, "we're not here to demand anything. We're here to offer partnership. Let them see who we really are." Daniel nodded. He understood the importance of this moment. Humanity had proven itself in battle. They had earned the respect of species that had dismissed them as primitives. But respect earned through violence could easily become fear, and fear was not a foundation for lasting friendship. Admiral Cole had understood this from the beginning. In the months since, he had ordered the human fleet to help with reconstruction across the affected systems. Human engineers had worked alongside and counterparts to repair damaged stations and rebuild destroyed colonies. Human medical teams had treated refugees without asking what species they belonged to. Human ships had patrolled the borders not as conquerors but as protectors. The message was clear. Humanity had not come to dominate, they had come to belong. High Speaker and the elderly who led the assembly rose to address the gathered representatives. The chamber fell silent immediately. When the High Speaker spoke, everyone listened. "We stand at a crossroads," she began, her voice amplified to reach every corner of the chamber. "For we have maintained our civilization through careful diplomacy and mutual non-interference. We believed this approach would protect us from the chaos of the universe. We were wrong." She turned and gestured toward the human delegation. "These beings came from the forgotten edges of our galaxy. We dismissed them as primitives, unworthy of our attention. And yet when we faced extinction, they came to our aid. They bled for us. They died for us. They asked for nothing in return." Daniel felt the weight of thousands of alien eyes turning toward him. Some were curious. Some were grateful. A few, he noticed, were suspicious or even hostile. Not everyone was happy about humanity's sudden rise to prominence. "Today," and continued, "we vote on a proposal to grant full membership to the species known as humanity. But more than that, we vote on what kind of civilization we wish to become. Do we continue as we were, isolated in our separate spheres, hoping that the next threat will pass us by? Or do we learn from those who saved us? Do we become something better?" The vote took less than an hour. Each species cast their decision through their representative, the results appearing on a massive display at the front of the chamber. Daniel watched the numbers climb, his heart pounding. When the final count was announced, humanity had been accepted into the Galactic Assembly by a margin of 642 to 58. Maria grabbed his arm, her professional composure breaking for just a moment as she smiled. Around them, the chamber erupted into sound. Hundreds of different species were cheering, applauding, making gestures of celebration that Daniel did not recognize but understood perfectly. They had done it. After 3,000 years of isolation, humanity was finally part of something larger. The ceremony that followed was long and complicated, full of rituals and traditions that Daniel did not fully understand. He stood where Maria told him to stand, said the words she had taught him to say, and tried to look dignified while dozens of alien dignitaries welcomed humanity to the assembly. But the moment he would remember most came afterward, when the formal ceremony was over and the delegates were mingling in the reception hall. Commander Al approached him through the crowd. She looked different than she had during the battle, less tired and more composed. Her scales had settled into a calm shade of green that Daniel had learned meant she was at peace. "Captain," she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. Daniel knew she had practiced the motion. It did not come naturally to the, "On behalf of my people, I welcome you to the assembly." He took her hand, feeling the cool smoothness of her scales against his palm. "Thank you, Commander. We're honored to be here." She held his gaze for a moment, her compound eyes reflecting the lights of the reception hall. "When I first heard Admiral Cole's transmission, I thought humanity was either foolish or delusional. No species would travel across the galaxy to fight a war that was not theirs. It made no sense." Daniel nodded. "And now?" Now I understand that you are neither foolish nor delusional. You are simply human, and I am glad of it." She released his hand but did not move away. There is a saying, "Those who arrive in darkness may carry their own light." For 12,000 years, we thought we understood what that meant. Now I believe we are only beginning to learn. Daniel thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The forgotten survey probe, the thousands of years alone, the wars that had nearly destroyed humanity and had instead made them stronger, the desperate signal they had intercepted, calling for help across the vast emptiness of space. "We didn't know if we would be welcomed," he admitted. "We didn't know if we would survive, but we came anyway, because that's what humans do. We reach for things we're not sure we can grasp. We hope even when hope seems foolish. We help even when we might not be helped in return." Al's scales shifted to a warm shade of gold. "Then you will fit well in the assembly, Captain. We have grown too careful over too cautious. Perhaps what we need most is a species foolish enough to teach us how to hope again." Daniel smiled. "I think we can manage that." He turned and looked out through the crystal dome at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there they were regrouping. Somewhere out there, other threats were waiting to be discovered. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, and humanity's journey was only beginning. But for the first time in 3,000 years, they were not alone. The forgotten species had been remembered. The ancient rumors had become reality. And the humans, who had once been dismissed as primitives on a distant world, now stood at the center of galactic civilization. Not as conquerors, not as saviors, but as partners, as friends, as proof that even the smallest light could push back the darkness. Daniel looked at the stars and smiled. This was only the beginning.